Hi, Sarah. This is Ed Kilgore. I'm managing editor of a site called The Democratic Strategist, a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute, and a special correspondent for the New Republic. And I write a lot about, I've written a lot about religion and politics over the years.
And I'm
my
Sarah
good friend
Posner.
Sarah Posner. Yeah, go ahead.
And I'm associate editor of Religion Dispatches. I'm also a senior correspondent for the American Prospect, and I've also written a great deal about religion and politics and the religious right. And I'm excited to talk about these issues with Ed.
Yeah, the reason we're talking about it right now is that there's been a considerable amount of recent publicity about the Tea Party movement representing sort of an occlusion of the Christian right and of the cultural issues that have so often, if not dominated, certainly characterized conservative and Republican politics over the years. What some elements of the news media seem to be telling us now is that the Tea Party folks are not that interested in these divisive cultural issues. They support a laser-like focus on issues of national debt, economics, and limited government. And, the Christian right is sort of far in the background and or isn't even a significant factor in the Republican Party anymore. What makes me very skeptical about these media claims, really there are two things. First, the mainstream media has been trying to bury the Christian right now ever since it first appeared. To be honest with you, a lot of media folks, and a lot of progressives for that matter, and a lot of political professionals are very uncomfortable with any religious-based political discourse. A lot of Republican political pros just think the Christian right's useful for mobilizing voters on election day, but otherwise is just trouble. And a lot of media folks just don't really take the whole thing very seriously or don't understand it. And at the same time, I think there are people in the Tea Party movement itself who have their own reasons for claiming that their movement is not about anything other than economic and quote-unquote constitutional issues.
Right.
I mean, a lot of these claims are coming from a group called the Tea Party Patriots, which is probably the most libertarian of the major Tea Party umbrella groups. And a lot's also coming from Dick Armey's Freedom Works, a group that's financed a lot of Tea Party activities and organized a lot of them, and that frankly is interested in helping the Republican Party through the Tea Party movement. So
right. And Armey has had his own conflicts with the religious right, most notably when he called James Dobson and a gang of thugs and bullies. That was back in 2006, I think. So he's had some issues with them in the past.
So, are you kind of with me on the skepticism about the militant secularism and laser-like focus of the Tea Party movement?
I actually think that first of all, the Tea Party movement is a pretty broad thing. What is the Tea Party movement? Is it Dick Armey's group, or is it the Tea Party Patriots, or is it Tea Party Nation, or is it these smaller upstart groups in the States? There's a lot of different moving parts to the Tea Party movement, so it's really hard to define what exactly we're talking about when we're talking about will they ally themselves with the religious right, or does the religious right want to ally itself with it. My experience doing reporting on this is that there are many, many people who do want that kind of alliance. There may be some resistance from the more libertarian end of the Tea Party movement, but nonetheless, it has very much reached out to big figures in the religious right. For example, at the 9/12 rally on the Mall, Kevin McCullough and Stephen Baldwin, who have their own Christian talk radio show and were the organizers of the Conservative Political Action Conference outreach to millennials last month at the CPAC convention.
This is the baby Baldwin, right?
Right, the baby Baldwin, not Jack Donaghy, right? And so they spoke at the 9/12 rally on the Mall, and they speak at tea parties elsewhere around the country. McCullough has at least, and they're very decidedly part of the Christian right. In fact, I recently wrote a piece about how they invited this long-standing Christian worldview educator to come and co-sponsor the XPAC, the outreach to the millennials at CPAC last month. And that organization called Summit Ministries has a lot of ties to the old Christian right, its founder, David Noble, got his start with Billy James Hargis's Christian Crusade, which in a lot of ways sounds a lot like the Tea Party movement in the sense that it's very, drumming up fears of communism, worrying that, Henry Kissinger was a communist. Sounds kind of familiar that, they're worrying about whether Obama is a communist. So, there are lots of different examples like that, but I do think that there is overlap in terms of the people who will show up at Tea Party events, and there are also a lot of people that I've seen at Tea Party events who sort of would also ally themselves with either, the religious right philosophically or religious right groups.
Well, Sarah, you're really taking me back. Several thousand years ago, I actually saw Billy James Hargis speak at a Baptist church in Cobb County, Georgia, sort of a fundraising gig. And, it was like watching Mick Jagger perform. This was before it came out that he, had a certain issue with pedophilia.
Yeah.
Billy James was one of the kind, but you're right. I think his group was called the Christian Anti-Communist Crusade.
The Christian Crusade, that's right.
Yeah. Anyway, I should point out for people watching this that Sarah is one of these people who doesn't simply pontificate about the Christian right. She actually does some serious original reporting, has for years, and gets out there and meets these folks. So she knows what she's talking about. In terms of the, perhaps there's a little bad faith going on among Tea Party activists, and again, it's difficult to make generalizations about them, who want to depict themselves as a coalition of just plain citizens who are fed up with big government and abrogation of the Constitution and don't want to appear extremist or controversial.
Right.
The thing that really caught my attention was the so-called National Tea Party Convention in February in Nashville, which was sponsored by yet another group calling itself the Tea Party Nation.
Right.
It got a lot of negative publicity because they charged a pretty hefty registration fee, had very limited participation, really tried to control the media around it, and also paid out a reported 100,000 smackers or so to have Sarah Palin speak. A speech, by the way, that was carried by virtually live by C-SPAN and virtually every cable channel.
Well, speaking of reaching out to the Christian right, but anyway.
Yeah, exactly. For people that haven't followed her closely, Sarah Palin is a lot of things in contemporary conservative politics, but her real base is the Right to Life movement. Right. These folks, these are the folks that knew exactly who she was before she was picked by John McCain to be his running mate, and frankly, the Christian right responded ecstatically to her selection by John McCain as the vice presidential candidate.
That's right. And, interestingly, if I can just jump in there,
sure.
The Susan B. Anthony list, which is an anti-abortion group that supports candidates who are opposed to abortion, they were on the ground in Alaska. They had state organization there in Alaska, and they knew Sarah Palin, before the rest of us knew her, even before probably the McCain camp knew her. And the president of the Susan B. Anthony list just had an op-ed in the Washington Post last weekend, kind of warning the Tea Party movement, don't forget about the pro-life movement. Abortion should be an important issue to you. So that was sort of interesting political maneuver by, a very solidly anti-abortion, organization that has solid religious right, Christian right credentials, basically issuing, a warning to the Tea Party movement. You can't exist without us.
Yeah, and I mean, the one kind of knowledgeable bit of empirical evidence we have on the views of Tea Party activists was a poll that CNN did, I think around the end of February, beginning of March, that discovered that, Tea Party activists are actually very culturally conservative, are more likely to consider abortion murder than any other subcategory of Americans. It's sometimes forgotten that even among self-conscious libertarians, most notably Dr. Ron Paul, there are a lot of people with some pretty hardcore pro-life views in particular.
Right.
It's not at all incompatible in their view with a general posture of hostility to big government. Once you start treating a zygote as a fully developed human being with all the rights and privileges accorded to America's citizenship, then there's no contradiction whatsoever. Getting back to the, sort of the public encounters between these two groups, though, again, I thought it was amusing that at the Nashville meeting, the organizers in Flax for the Tea Party convention, went out of their way afterwards to say, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with crazy people.
Right.
We need to be on watch to make sure that crazy people aren't the face of this movement. Yet that very event, they chose, immigrant baiter Tom Tancredo as their keynote speaker. Then Joseph Farah of WorldNet Daily, probably America's most, or one of America's most prominent birthers, had a major address. And then they had breakout sessions where Christian right war horses, Judge Roy Moore of Alabama, the famous Ten Commandments judge, and Rick Scarborough of Vision America, which was a co-sponsor of the event, by the way.
Right.
And at the same time, you've got the people running the event saying, "Oh, we don't want to have anything to do with these extremists." So that leads me to think that there's something a little disingenuous about the claim that the Tea Party movement is not interested in divisive or extremist figures or in cultural issues. And I recall all the people I just mentioned got rapturous responses from the crowd there, as did Sarah Palin.
Right, of course. Well, I think that it's a function of a couple of things. One is that they realize that to pull in as broad a base as they possibly can, they need to reach out to all these different constituencies that have traditionally made up the conservative movement. The Christian right, the libertarians, the anti-tax people, that all of that needs to come together in order to have the critical mass that they would need to be a movement. But at the same time, they realize that they've gotten a lot of negative press for, in fact, a lot of the antics that happened yesterday, this week on the Mall when they had their anti-health care reform rally, with, Representative Louis Gohmert coming out with his, the bill in his hand and talking about how he had, an abortion in his hand and people making other sort of, ridiculous, outlandish claims, signs about Obama being a socialist again. So I think that they view that negative publicity that they've gotten as a liability. And so I think that they think that perhaps if they say, well, we don't associate with all that crazy stuff. We're just, patriotic Americans who are worried about big government and taxes and the national debt. So don't pay attention to that. But at the same time, they realize, I think, that that constituency is drawn to them because they have a lot of sort of shared beliefs about the role of government, and that just from a numbers crunching point of view, they probably can't pull it together without all of those pieces of the puzzle.
Well, that leads me to another topic. Put aside how they're projecting themselves and so forth, or what the media says about them. Is there really anything incompatible between the Tea Party movement's rhetoric and message and that of the Christian right, number one, and number two, if these are compatible and in some ways intertwined conservative movements, how do they affect each other? My personal hypothesis is that, the extremism of the Tea Party folks and of the Christian right sort of feed on each other. That, what's been the real hallmark of the hardcore Christian right in recent years has been an extraordinary sort of radicalism, not just about American politics and government, but American society. They've adopted what I would call a prophetic stance, suggesting that we're a fundamentally wicked society and that the normal rules of civility and party politics shouldn't apply when you have, say, legalized abortion, which a lot of Christian right folks frequently describe as an American Holocaust.
Right.
and frequently compare themselves to the confessing church dissenters against Hitler. That's pretty similar to the overall stance, whether it's secular or religious, of the Tea Party activists who have fairly apocalyptic language about the nature of American government society and who, like the Christian right, frequently relies on claims of sort of a massive conspiracy to turn America into something that it hasn't been and shouldn't be. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that the healthcare reform issue was one that was kind of perfect for them to bring that all together because, in spite of the fact that it's obviously not socialism or communism, they were successful in a lot of sectors as in portraying a government takeover of healthcare reform, of healthcare to be some sort of communist plot. And at the same time, the anti-abortion part of the religious right, objected to the, government funding of abortion or the creation of abortion mills or the creation of an abortion mandate. That's how they portrayed it.
No, and there are quotes around all those statements, right? Air quotes.
Yeah, definitely. Big air quotes. So I think that it provided this little incubator for them to come together with this apocalyptic idea that, the U.S. government was about to take over your life and tell you what to do and tell you when to go to the doctor and when you were going to die and that you had to have an abortion and that guess what, everybody, you are going to have to pay for everybody else's abortion too. And so they use that kind of language to appeal to constituencies that, are anti-abortion but not necessarily, have this apocalyptic theology. Or to people who are worried about, big government intrusion into their lives, but not necessarily a communist plot. But that it really also feeds this more extremist element that does rely on these apocalyptic narratives that were very prevalent during the Cold War, that communism was, the Antichrist, and that, we're hurtling towards Armageddon, which, it didn't happen in the Cold War. But, you see a lot of the same rhetoric coming back now.
Well, let's talk about a couple of specifics on that front. Something that really caught my attention was this amazing and, to me, horrifying moment in the healthcare debate when Governor Palin went on Facebook and did what is, charitably, most people don't write brilliant prose on their Facebook posts. So I'm not really attacking her for that. But Sarah Palin did a Facebook post, sort of rambled around incoherently about, government takeover of healthcare, and then faithfully made the assertion that the bill would set up death panels.
Right.
Which was an allusion to a very small provision in the bill that would have somewhat strengthened a commission on Medicare spending that actually Republicans had created, and that would include counseling on end-of-life issues.
Right.
Now, that just caught on, that whole claim went completely viral almost immediately. In a period of a couple of weeks, you saw just rank-and-file Republicans beginning to make this argument. It was very, very effective in scaring seniors that somehow or other healthcare reform would lead to termination of life support or termination of medical coverage from a cost point of view, And what fascinated me about that is that, knowing Palin's background, the Right to Life movement has always insisted that supporters of legalized abortion also favor euthanasia.
Right.
That was always part of the argument that, well, okay, if you tolerate the murder of 1 million unborn children every year, the next step for these people who fundamentally don't respect life is going to be to start killing off inconvenient old folks. And again,
pulling
the Nazi,
plug on Terry Schiavo.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I thought it was very interesting that this attack on healthcare reform, which was not done in religious terms, happened to coincide with one of the favorite smears of the Christian right. Did you notice that too?
Yes. I think that very much worked in tandem and worked to their advantage. I mean, you see, even as we're talking today, the abortion issue remains a sticking point even for some, a very small handful of Democrats in the House and the Senate. And even allegedly, for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which claims to support healthcare reform generally. And so a lot of those things came together to sort of fuel this apocalyptic idea about what the healthcare reform would do in terms of abortion. I mean, in fact, there's a coalition of anti-abortion groups which is called Stop the Abortion Mandate, as if the healthcare bill requires people to have abortions.
Yeah. Just yesterday on the popular Red State conservative blog site, I saw another one of these rants about healthcare reform representing euthanasia and population control through abortion and euthanasia.
Right.
I mean, these folks take this seriously.
Yes, very seriously. But I think there's a broader, I think, God and country element to this, if I might call it that, in the sense that the Christian right has always portrayed true patriots as being, Christians who believe that we're a Christian nation, and that's the way the founders envisioned it. And the separation of church and state was a myth made up by judicial activists on the Supreme Court and secularists who want to, bring down our Christian nation. And I think that kind of rhetoric also plays a role in this potential Tea Party Christian right alliance. A few weeks ago, I talked to an activist in Georgia who started a website called TV Town Hall, where they are basically webcasting videos by citizen journalists and by activists. He kind of hopes to make that sort of like this hub of where people can go and look at what other activists are doing around the country.
Well, speaking of Georgia, you've done some reporting on
Ralph
our
Reed.
Old buddy Ralph Reed.
Right. And so I was going to sort of use this as a segue to talk about Reed, because this Georgia activist that I talked to, he said, what the Tea Party movement needs is more reverence to God. Basically, an acknowledgement of this Christian nation ideology. And part of that Christian nation ideology is that government should be limited. I mean, basically, like they're looking for a theocracy. So if you have what they call big government, then that gets in the way of the Christian principles dictating how our society should be run instead of the quote unquote bureaucrats in Washington. Now this Georgia activist said to me, I think that Ralph Reed, who has a new organization called the Faith and Freedom Coalition, is going to be a key player in all of this. He's, a superb fundraiser. He's a great political strategist, and he understands, this crossover between the limited government argument and the argument about faith and religion. And in fact, his organization is called the Faith and Freedom Coalition, where, he's trying to recreate the Christian coalition of the 90s, but he's also emphasizing these economic issues.
Well, I just as a quick aside about my old buddy Ralph, I'm from Georgia, by the way.
Right.
I'm deeply familiar with Ralph's political career. I noticed that one of the states where Ralph is already setting up a sort of a local franchise of the Faith and Freedom Coalition is Iowa.
Right.
Which is important to remember because the 2012 presidential contest will, as always, be launched in Iowa. And this is a state where cultural issues are actually red hot right now among conservatives because of the recent action by the state Supreme Court of Iowa to sanction same-sex marriages. That is the overriding issue for conservative activists in Iowa. It's affecting the governor's race there, and you could see the possibility that no matter how much Republicans decide rationally that they want to fight out the 2010 and 2012 elections on economic issues, on limited government, so on and so forth, a presidential campaign that is shaped by the Iowa caucuses probably can't avoid cultural issues. And if you look at what happened there in 2008 when Mike Huckabee, despite like a 50-to-1 financial disadvantage, waxed Mitt Romney
in
the caucuses there, and arguably that kept Romney from seriously competing with John McCain for the presidential nomination. This could be a pretty big deal.
Well, I actually talked to for the piece I wrote about Reed's new effort. I talked to Steve Scheffler, who is the head of the Iowa Christian Alliance, which used to be the Iowa Christian Coalition, and then broke from the Christian Coalition, and now is launching sort of an adjunct organization, which is the Iowa chapter of Reed's Faith and Freedom Coalition.
Yeah, and the ICA, by the way, is the group that when Rick Santorum showed up to campaign in Iowa recently, were circulating flyers saying that the guy wasn't really a pro-life guy. Which, interestingly enough, produced an apology by Santorum that he had erred in the past by doing things like supporting Arlen Specter's last re-election.
But
that's
Iowa
a pretty
Christian
good
Alliance
indication.
Distributed that because he
I'm
spoke
pretty
at their
sure.
fundraiser. I think it was somebody else because he spoke at their fundraiser.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. I'm not sure where the flyers came from. But he used that occasion to apologize for his lapses in the past.
Right.
But anyway, that's a sign of how extreme conservative politics in Iowa are, particularly in the context of a presidential election. And remember that the Iowa caucuses are at least on the Republican side, have always been a low attendance event dominated by social conservative activists. I mean, this is where in 1988 Pat Robinson actually ran ahead of George Herbert Walker Bush.
And Scheffler, who now is heading up, Reed's Faith and Freedom chapter in Iowa, worked for Robertson's 1988 campaign and is pretty much considered, an old hand in Iowa politics, kind of the go-to guy when you want to get your finger on the pulse of what Iowa Christian conservatives are thinking. Right. And when I asked him about, what about the Tea Party? And he said, there's overlap. You'll find some people, going to both types of events. But the one thing that really knits us together is our belief that Obama has us marching on the road to socialism.
Oh.
And so, it's interesting. It keeps coming back to this idea that there is a very scary, big government that, in a lot of sort of millennialist evangelical parlance is, a sign of the Antichrist. And so when you see that kind of crossover, that like, oh, yes, we agree. The thing we agree about is that the Democrats are socialists and have us on the road to socialism. I mean, this is something that I've heard, Sarah Palin rallies during the presidential campaign, this is what people would tell me. Now you see the Tea Partiers saying it and religious right activists saying it, and this is what they think ties them together beyond just kind of the overlap that, there are people who belong to religious right organizations like Concerned Women for America or the Christian Coalition who also go to Tea Party events. I mean, it's that kind of worldview idea of, that there are worldviews that are correct. And then there's, the Christian worldview is the only worldview that is correct. And then there are all these other worldviews that compete with that.
And they're all religions. Yeah. Well, that reminds me, I wanted to come back to something you mentioned earlier about the Christian nation concept and how that connects with Tea Party rhetoric. I mean, one thing that the Tea Party folks are really notable for is stressing a rather extreme form of constitutional originalism. Mm-hmm. That the country has gone off the tracks, or went off the tracks a long time ago, because we stopped respecting the Constitution as it was written by the founders. In fact, one of the biggest, most frequently heard arguments against healthcare reform is that it's unconstitutional. Right. Because it wasn't mentioned in the Constitution. Healthcare wasn't mentioned as a federal responsibility in the Constitution. Now that is interesting on several levels, but partly because the Christian right is also deeply invested in its own form of constitutional originalism. As you mentioned, much of their rhetoric depends on the idea that this was designed to be a Christian nation, mm-hmm. and that a series of liberal court decisions or secular humanist court decisions over the years have thwarted that original intent.
That's right.
So there's a lot of this talk about, and it's also very important, by the way, to the Christian right to view the Declaration of Independence as an integral part of the constitutional design, mm-hmm. because the Declaration of Independence, unlike the Constitution itself, talks about God, mm-hmm. talks about the Creator, mm-hmm. talks about inalienable rights created by the Creator.
This is why they brought it with the Mount Vernon statement that they signed just before CPAC last month.
And every document that I've seen from the Tea Party movement, and even from the conservative movement generally, mm-hmm. like the Mount Vernon Manifesto, mm-hmm. Mentions that.
And I think that this
which is a pretty clear dog whistle to the Christian right that we're on the same page with you guys.
Right. And I think the way that I see the anti-abortion movement kind of trying to come in with that is by making the argument that the fetus is entitled to those inalienable rights.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And by the way, this is Christian nation.
Right, exactly.
Which kind of conveniently ignores some of the views of Jefferson and Madison and others about religious liberty, but that's a separate argument.
Right.
So I think we do agree that there's potential overlap. I continue to feel strongly that the secular apocalyptic outlook of Tea Party libertarians and the religious-based apocalyptic prophetic stance of the Christian right are highly compatible, and in fact maybe egging each other on into more and more extremism, which sometimes it's easy to forget this, but to me the most remarkable political event of the last year has been that the Republican Party and the conservative movement have done something rather unusual in American political history, in the wake of two consecutive kind of disastrous political showings, they have very self-consciously and explicitly decided to move to the right.
Mm-hmm. Which seems like an odd thing to do.
Excuse me?
Which seems like it seemed like an odd thing to do right after Obama got elected.
It's certainly counterintuitive. We need to shrink our coalition, make it purer. Now, a lot of that has to do with very understandable efforts to repudiate the legacy of George W. Bush, whom most of the Tea Party folks consider, a dangerous big spender, if not a liberal.
Right. And you can see all the Republicans straining to make themselves seem acceptable to the Tea Partiers.
Well, that's why it's been so important for Republicans to attack TARP every other breath. By indirection, they're repudiating, the big government legacy of the Bush administration, the deficits and everything that comes with it. So they don't hold themselves responsible for any of that.
Right, conveniently
even
so.
Though some of the people we're talking about, treated George W. Bush as a world historical colossus, after the initial phase of the Iraq War. Not to mention, the Christian right has always adored him. So,
right. But what was interesting to me, at least at the 9/12 rally on the Mall, was
explain to us what 9/12 is, by the way.
Oh, well, 9/12 was the rally on the Mall last year, 9/12/09, which was inspired by Glenn Beck's tearful call for America to come back to its values that it was inspired to take on right the day after 9/11. But what struck me talking to people there was how they were angry about government bailouts, but seemed to not recognize at all that had happened initially happened under the Republicans' watch, under Bush's watch at least. And that they were angry about bailouts because they felt that government had taken over corporations and was basically running corporations, so that got in the way of free enterprise. But, they could not see the argument that corporations really run the government via lobbying and so forth.
That leads me to kind of the last topic we sort of went to talk about is, if everything we're saying is more or less accurate, how should progressives react? I mentioned it based on what you just said because there are some folks on the left who have been arguing for a tactical or even a strategic alliance between progressives and the Tea Party folks, because they too are upset about intermixture of corporate and government power, partly in the civil liberties arena, where libertarians and some folks on the left, often have a very similar view of things like TARP, but also, but also because of the common secularism of most folks on the left, and at least the perceived libertarian strain, perceived secular strain of libertarianism.
Right.
So, some progressives seem to be arguing for driving a wedge between libertarians and Republican conservatives, presumably including the Christian right, making common cause with them. Do you think there's any purchase for that strategy?
Well, I think for that to make sense, that progressives not to ally themselves with leaders or agitators of the Tea Party movement who have essentially endorsed and promote this extreme version of libertarianism, because I don't think that that's what progressives really stand for, is libertarianism. But I think that some of the people that the Tea Party movement appeals to are people who are very scared. Like I met people at the 9/12 March, for example, who were economically, financially, really frightened about what was going to happen to their families. And so here they were presented with an argument that kind of made sense to them. That, okay, you're scared about the economy? Well, it's the government's fault because the government is taking over the corporations and the banks. And if we let the government run the banks, then we're going to hell in a handbasket. And so, is your job and your family's jobs and so forth. So this, they were presented with an argument that kind of, in some way, had some logic to them, I guess, or at least some emotional appeal to them. I think that instead of trying to, drive wedges and form alliances with people that you don't really agree with, progressives have to make a coherent, emotionally compelling argument about the dangers of corporatism in our government. And, I don't really like the demonizations that the Tea Party movement engages in, and I don't think that, it works well conceptually to just demonize everything. But you do need to frame and describe what the problem is. What is causing, what was the cause of the crash? Was the cause of the crash that government had taken over Goldman Sachs? I don't think so. There is a demon, if not an enemy, someone at fault here, or a group of people at fault. And, progressives, instead of trying to, form sort of fake alliances with the Tea Party movement, I think would be better served creating those kinds of narratives and making a case for what you do about it.
Well, I'm all for progressive coherence. I do think, though, that some of the talk about, finding the reasonable folks in the Tea Party movement and or maybe even co-opting some of its appeal, to me kind of smacks of the old false consciousness argument, most famously made by Thomas Frank in What's the Matter with Kansas, that a lot of these right-wing folks are actually suffering from displaced anxiety over their poor treatment by corporations, and if we can just get them to focus on the evils of corporations and on economic issues and the good things government can do for them, they'll get over all this silly preoccupation with the metaphysical order of the world and religion and all that stuff. I personally think that is a really damaging illusion of folks on the left. All the polling I've seen is that most people that have extraordinarily conservative views on economic issues, role of government, you name it, are also conservative in other areas too. As I said, most of the polling on the Tea Party movement, whatever it actually stands for, most of the people involved in that as activists are very conservative on every issue, including cultural issues. And it's not easy to neatly separate economic and cultural anxieties. Never has been, probably never will be.
Right.
So I guess where I'm going with this is that, I personally think that, at the risk of making a generalization about a very disorganized, decentralized sort of tendency, that for the most part the Tea Party movement represents very conservative Republicans,
mm-hmm.
some of whom call themselves independents because they've always felt that the Republican Party was too wimpy,
mm-hmm.
Not insufficiently conservative, who were radicalized by the events of the last couple of years,
mm-hmm.
Including the economic collapse and most notably the election of Barack Obama.
Yes.
I'm sure you noticed this too, that back during the latter stages of the presidential campaign, John McCain was out there getting yelled at by people at his own rallies who were upset that he wasn't talking more about Jeremiah Wright and about Acorn and wasn't making the kind of radical case that the country was literally being taken away by socialists and secularists that you hear from the right today. So I think in all these discussions of the Tea Party movement, for all their notoriety, you have to ask, who are these folks? Are they really new? Yes, they're excited, but what percentage of the population do they actually represent?
Right.
And I think that's got to be pretty fundamental to any progressive response.
Right. I do think that they represent a small, the sort of hardcore folks that you're talking about, people who would yell at John McCain for, not bringing up Jeremiah Wright enough. I think that they represent a small segment. But they also represent the politically active and
right.
mobilized and motivated segment. But, I met this woman at a Tea Party rally who, didn't really kind of fit that mold, but she was kind of more of that, ooh, I don't like big government and I'm afraid they've taken over the corporations, but without a lot of the sort of overheated rhetoric. I met a couple people like that. And I guess I was thinking not so much about sort of the hardcore, the folks, but the folks who are susceptible to the argument that the whole problem is that the government has taken over the corporations and is ruining free enterprise. That there's a segment of those people who are sort of on the outer edges of the Tea Party movement, susceptible or potentially receptive to some of those libertarian arguments, or at least some of the arguments about what's wrong with the economy, and could be persuaded that it's not that the government has taken over corporations, but there are other reasons why the economy has collapsed, and other solutions other than completely deregulating everything.
Yeah, well, this does kind of bring us back to a very old topic that both of us have talked and written about for years of, how do progressives deal with, grassroots, populist, conservative political movements, whether you're talking about the Tea Party movement, the Christian right, or both. Do you ignore them? Do you treat them with respect but try to reason with them? Do you co-opt them? Do you split them? What do you do? I know this really does echo the long-standing debate among progressives about how to deal with the Christian right. Do you mobilize a Christian left? Do you reach out to reasonable people who share views, a worldview that you may not share, and try to split them off? You think that's a relevant discussion today?
I think it's very relevant. I think what you're going to see more of, I would predict that you would see more of the moderate evangelicals like Rich Cizik and Dave Gushee and Joel Hunter trying to dial back some of that to make it clear to the rest of the world that not all evangelicals fall into this millennialist, dispensationalist, Armageddon is coming camp. But also to encourage evangelicals who may be on the fence. Now, Cizik and Gushee have started this new organization, the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good. And I think that it has a role to play in that discussion of what do evangelicals want? And, they want to see climate change addressed, and they want healthcare reform passed. And, not all of them think that, the healthcare reform bill is, kill granny kind of thing. But, it's not clear, whether an alliance between them and secular progressives is going to work in every instance, and could work in a case-by-case instance if they want to work on a particular bill together. But what does it mean to have that kind of role of religion in politics, even if it's not the conservative religion that secular progressives revile in the Christian right? So there are a lot of complicated questions in those sorts of things, and it's still not clear, like you said, public opinion polling on evangelicals shows that, white evangelicals are the most conservative religious bloc in this country. And that even though, there's a lot of talk of the millennials, shifting a little bit on being so hardcore on gay marriage and abortion, still, they're the most conservative voting bloc on gay marriage and abortion.
Right. My own view on this, and it gets back to my general view about the Christian right, and for that matter, the Tea Party movement, is that probably the most useful thing that all of us can do with respect to these folks is to, through every means we can, get them to think twice about what I've been calling the prophetic stance. Mm-hmm. Even if they don't like abortion, even if they're uncomfortable about gay marriage, even if they're upset that the courts won't let a small town have a municipal creche at Christmas, even if they're upset about all these things, we're not living in Nazi Germany or in Babylon. And that this sort of, radical perspective towards their own society and towards their own country is unpatriotic and makes any kind of real politics, any kind of real civic engagement impossible. I think that's just as true of the Tea Party folks as it is of the Christian right, that maybe you'll never get them to vote for you, maybe you'll never get them to like you, but at a minimum to work with the more reasonable elements in the evangelical movement or among libertarians who at least are willing to make the case that we're not living in the end times, that quasi-revolutionary political activity, whether it's focused on economic issues or cultural issues, is fundamentally un-American. That's sort of a vague way of looking at it, I suppose, but I really do think that would have a greater impact, not just on partisan politics and public policy, but on the tone of political discourse in America than anything else we can do. It's just, you're not a prophet.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a tough road to hoe because, that scary stuff about, Satan and the end of the world, it really gets people's attention. And it really, gets the fundraising dollars rolling. And
we're about out of time, but I think part of what we're driving at here is the particular importance in conservative politics of what's been called American exceptionalism.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that this country was designated by God to be a very different place, a beacon of freedom, a bulwark against tyranny, and so on and so forth. That is equally appealing to religious-based conservatives, who feel that we're fighting the Antichrist,
mm-hmm.
And more secular conservatives who, there's a reason they're forever suggesting that progressives are European in their outlook, or favor that godless Canadian healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
It's where the secular and religious extremism sort of coincide in this idea that America can't be like anywhere else, can't abide by the same rules as other societies because we're special.
Right.
And that's a very tricky sort of mindset to deal with, particularly among progressives who are always afraid that they're going to appear insufficiently American or insufficiently patriotic. So it's a tricky business, right?
Yeah, but I think that fear is unfounded. There are different ways to define patriotism, and I think you have to have some, what you might call, cojones to just get out there and, say that this is patriotism. Patriotism isn't just, all this God and free enterprise and American exceptionalism stuff. It's there's another way or multiple other ways to define it.
Yeah, sure. Some would make the argument that things like separation of church and state is pretty American.
Right, like the Baptists. The Baptists who were the original, big promoters of the separation of church and state, notwithstanding what the Christian right will tell you.
Alan Wolfe has very eloquently made the argument that without the tradition of the Jeffersonian tradition of church-state separation, the very religious groupings that now are screaming about secular humanism, conservative evangelical Protestants, would not have flourished.
Mm-hmm.
That means a lot to me personally because I was raised as a Southern Baptist,
right.
And as a child I was taught that separation of church and state was the distinctive Baptist heritage, but we've come a long way down from that.
Yep.
Anyway, Sarah, it's always fun to talk to you. I think we're probably out of time.
I think that's right, but thank you for engaging in all of these very interesting issues.
Well, thank you, and tell us again about the site that you're now involved with, Religion Dispatches.
Religion Dispatches, and I blog regularly there, write the occasional feature, and I edit a lot of the content that's there. And, we cover everything from politics to culture to the Academy Awards, religion across the globe. So
one-stop shop.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. We'll definitely check out that site. I'm going to be reading it regularly. And as always, Sarah, it's great to talk to you.
Thanks, Ed.
Bye-bye.
Bye.